God must have decided that the results of the covenant with Noah were pretty good, because here again in today's passage we hear about another covenant that God is offering. By convention, we say covenant with Noah and covenant with Abraham, but it is really a covenant by means of, or via. In other words, the covenant promises offered to Noah and to Abraham are ours as well as an inheritance. The benefits of biblical covenant accrue to all of God's people. All of God's people are subject to the expectations that they imply. In today's scripture, the covenant is offered, and it's also a little bit of name changing that you hear going on there. And as Renee has already alluded to, this is very often the case that when something significant happens of sacred import, there is also a name change. So in this case, we go from Abram, meaning exalted ancestor, to Abraham, or ancestor of a multitude. And likewise, Sarah gets a name change. Her name, Sarai, implies a chief or a governor. The name change for her is just to change the ending, which softens the impact a little bit. It feminizes her name slightly. Now, it's commonly believed that Abraham was granted this covenant in reward for faithful behavior. As a matter of fact, in many of common people's thinking, we think that he was given the covenant because of that horrific story about the near sacrifice of Isaac. Nothing could be farther from the truth. In fact, Abraham is introduced only in a genealogical record at the very end of chapter 11 of the book of Genesis. And then the actual story about him begins in chapter 12. Listen to this passage. In particular, listen to how many times the word bless is used here. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So in other words, even before we get to the drama of Sarai and Abram's barrenness, or the shenanigans with Abram's nephew Lot and the towns of Sodom and Gomorrah, or the story of the slave Hagar bearing a son, or any of those other stories, let alone the story of Isaac and the near sacrifice, before any of those happen, God has already made a promise of a covenant. And notice how widely God intends the blessing of this promise to spread for all the families of earth. The blessing is for all who will bless Abraham. So far, we have two covenants that shed grace in a very unilateral way. These are both considered covenants of blessing or grace or promise. Now, next week, you will hear from Renee about a covenant with Moses, which might seem a little different. It has more of a sense of mutual promise and co-obligation. It's considered a covenant of law. Now, this passage from chapter 12 that I just read to you frames the covenant in terms of a blessing. We translate what he said as God says, "I will make my covenant." But the Hebrew language here is really quite literal. It says, "I am giving covenant of me between me and between you. God is offering. God is establishing. God is promising. If the covenant with Noah tells us about God exercising self-restraint, the covenant with Abraham is one wherein we learn about God's provisioning. And this shows up in three significant stories. First, God promises to provide the new land, in effect, a new country, a new livelihood. Second, God promises to provide children and ancestors. Now, this promise will take many years to come to fruition and is the source of some real strain between God and Abraham, between God and Sarah, and between Abraham and Sarah. It is this protracted delay that leads Sarah to propose to Abraham that he do what is the cultural norm of the time, which is to have a child by a household servant, Hagar, and adopt that one as his own. This turns out badly because shortly after Hagar's child is born, Sarah has Isaac, and she demands that Isaac receive undivided attention and favor. So, to his shame, Abraham sends Hagar and his son Ishmael out into the wilderness. But God's promise of provisioning extends to her as well. For while Hagar and the child wander, desperate and parched in the wilderness, God provides a well. I pause to note that our Muslim brothers and sisters claim access to the promises of Abraham through this son Ishmael, while Christians and Jews mostly claim ours through Isaac. Now, the third story of provisioning is that rich and horrifying story of Isaac and the near sacrifice. Now, I'm sure it will be a sermon for another day, but for today, let's remember this, that the pivotal moment of that story is when God provides a lamb, the rightful item of sacrifice. God provides. If the covenant with Noah is about divine restraint and about learning that we can see God in nature's small beauties, then the covenant with Abraham is about divine provisioning. And the rightful response for us to exercise is patient faithfulness. Abraham's story is a lesson in trust, sometimes under unbelievable circumstances. Still, and this is key, this is a covenant of promise freely given and without condition. We do not need to trust in God to inherit the covenant. But when we truly inherit the covenant, it should inspire trust in us. That is a faithful response to the covenant God has made with us. So, people of God, God has amazing bounty and kindness towards us, generosity towards us. All that is a gift to our lives. God has offered us the gift of covenant as well, quite freely, providing for us, promising to us. In view of this, how can we not open our hearts and trust in God?